Thank you, Joe.
So today's presentation addresses a topic our club has been exploring since adopting our strategic plan in 2020. We agreed back then to put a major focus on economic and workforce development, and we subsequently zeroed in on 3 essentials for a robust, well-balanced economy: workforce housing, year-round childcare for working families, and workforce education and training. During the past year, we've hosted presentations on all these topics. Today's talk is about housing. Our previous talks on this subject included a real estate market review of existing homes in our region by Martin Cates, and a discussion of various workforce housing solutions by Joe Cloutier. More recently, Marla O'Byrne told us about the Island Housing Trust on Mount Desert, and Tia Anderson updated us on MidCoast Habitat for Humanity. You can access recordings of all these talks on our website. We've learned a great deal, but have a long way to go as we seek housing solutions that match the needs of our region and enable people who work locally to live within reach of their jobs. An essential first step in figuring that out is now complete. Rob Wasserstrom has been working on an in-depth housing needs assessment since August and will share his findings with us today. Rob has had some excellent help with this effort. As consultants specializing in public affairs and stakeholder engagement, Rob and his wife, Susan Ryder, have conducted extensive needs assessments for nearly 30 years in the US and overseas. We are so glad that as members of our club, they've applied their experience to helping us understand the housing crisis right here, close to home. I'd like to turn the meeting over now to Rob, but first, a quick reminder that if you have questions for him, please post them in the chat window so that we can read them out to him and he can give his responses at the end of his talk. So Rob, welcome.
Thank you. Can we do the slides? Fantastic. Okay. So I call this the housing crisis report. It's probably a little dramatic, but I think you'll see what the logic is. Could you show the next slide, please? So the committee has decided to focus on Knox County and the adjacent communities, because as you can see from this map, the commuting times really make this one region, so one region for housing and other activities. So we're talking about basically from Northport to Waldoboro. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to read a lot of this because I used to be able to remember all these details, but you know, that time is long past in my life. So we found that the MidCoast shares a problem with other New England coastal areas and also many Western or Rocky Mountain resort communities. Soaring home prices, rapid conversion of year-round housing to seasonal homes or rental homes, and almost no new construction. Workers in these areas now live far away from their workplace, or they simply move away. What can Rotarians do? We've been working with an informal group headed by Stephanie Smith that is exploring the idea of founding a MidCoast Regional Housing Trust. So for the last 3 or 4 months of 2021, we did a needs assessment of workforce housing in our area, and we're now finishing a benchmark study of the best practices in New England. There are some really good housing trusts in other communities, and obviously we want to learn from them before we make any big mistakes. Basically, I think we can summarize this by saying that we have 2 related problems, not one. I call them income and inventory. So here are a few key findings from the needs assessment. Next slide, please. Household incomes in our region are quite low. 2/3 of households in Knox County, according to the Maine Housing Authority, now struggle to pay their rent or mortgage. I'm not going to go through all the details of this table. I'd be happy to. They're in the report, and be happy to send the report to anyone who wants to see it. But according to the Census Bureau, a family with 2 workers making $60,000 a year could buy a home that costs around $150,000. But the median price of that home in our region now is more than twice that amount. It's $370,000, which would require an income of about $135,000 a year, plus as much as $75,000 in cash for a down payment. Next slide, please. I think we skipped one. Yep, there we are. So this is particularly hard on young families, which are the first 3 bars on this graph. So each color represents one of the counties that we're talking about: blue for Knox, green for Lincoln, and yellow for Waldo. And as you can see, the annual median income of around that $60,000 is the dotted line across the graph. Young families up where the wage earners are up to the age of 25, don't even come close to that. But the scary thing to me is that the 2 middle sets of bars, which are the prime years of most families' working life, barely touch or barely exceed that median income. And the median income doesn't come close to allowing a family to buy a house in our region anymore. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I think we all know, and you've heard from previous speakers, but and we all know anecdotally, is that housing prices are rising sharply in the MidCoast, while new construction has slowed to a crawl. In fact, there is virtually no new construction. I checked with municipalities. Most of the overwhelming majority of building permits that have been issued in the last 4 or 5 years are for renovations or work on existing buildings, and very few have been issued for anything new. And then at the same time, around 1/3 of our housing stock has been converted to seasonal rentals or vacation homes, or it already was. That's pretty much the average on the coast of Maine, by the way. We just learned this last week that on the coast in Massachusetts, on Martha's Vineyard, for example, there are already about 40% of housing that's not available to full-time working residents on the island. And I think probably we're headed in the same direction. Next slide. As we know, since COVID, home prices have been accelerating. This is Martin Cates has given us this information about housing prices over the past year. As you can see, it looks like housing in Lincoln County has really sort of, the prices have sort of leveled out, which could be good news, but it's not. It actually means that there aren't many houses available to sell. So the ones that sold have sold, and then there's no inventory on the market. By the way, I'm presenting here the visuals from this report, but if anybody is really fascinated by what those numbers really are, there are probably 30 pages of numbers in this report, which is available to everyone. Next slide, please. This is the story for rents. Rents are actually increasing even faster than housing prices, than home prices. And so most rents, including, or I should say in particular in Rockland, which is our major workforce employment area, are out of reach. As buildings get converted or change hands, the tenants are actually having to leave and move who knows where. A lot of them are moving down into Warren and Waldoboro, but the housing down there is also filling up pretty rapidly. Next slide. So what does the future look like? This is very important. There's some rosy predictions that come from state agencies that promote tourism or promote Maine in general, but the Department of Labor, the State Department of Labor, gives us a very different view of what's going on. By 2028, according to the Department of Labor, 15,800 new workers, almost 16,000 new workers will be needed in Maine, primarily to replace people who are retiring. Those are not new jobs that are being created. Most of those workers will actually be in the low income range, mainly home health care aides and service workers of various kinds. What this represents, I was totally stunned to learn this, but what this represents is basically a downshifting of household income from the middle range jobs, the middle income jobs, skilled jobs that used to pay for homes, to the basically the less than $18 and less an hour, to call them something, unskilled jobs. And even in the middle range, major employers report, we did a survey of local employers to include in this report, and they report that 1/4 of potential new hires in the skilled range have turned down their job offer because of high housing costs. These offers include teachers who start in our school district at $43,000 a year, skilled craftsmen, machine operators, and other middle income workers, generally in the $40,000 to $65,000 range. Next slide, please. So what's the solution? What can we do? Well, we're considering, as Joan mentioned, we're looking at the possibility of forming a housing trust, or as it's also sometimes called, a community land trust. I'm going to call them community land trust because it's the more common name. So community land trusts generally focus on low to middle income housing and seniors who also want to downsize but have no place to move. And if they could move, then a house would be available on the market. The properties that are owned or acquired by land trusts usually are, once they've been acquired, the land trust uses various mechanisms to place restrictions on the house or the property, the land, to ensure perpetual affordability, so that when the house turns over, when there's a resale, it doesn't just go back to market rate. And that's an area that we're trying to learn as much about as we can. And finally, there's a land trust use a mechanism called shared equity. Shared equity means that the homeowner who buys the land and buys the house and maybe lives there for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, gets a share of the equity as the house rises in value, but doesn't get a very large slice of equity. So they walk away with enough money, hopefully, to get into the housing market without a subsidy from the land trust or charity or some other subsidy. But they don't ride a $150,000 house up to $450,000 and get to take all that money with them. Generally, land trusts sell the house outright, the buildings, but they have restricted covenants. They own and have restrictive covenants on the land under the house, and that's the mechanism. That's the mechanism they use to ensure perpetual affordability. Obviously, this is a very long and detailed discussion. What are the challenges? and decisions that we have to make as we think about how to address these issues in our community? Well, there are quite a few, and John and Joan can help me out here in the Q&A session. But some of the basic ones are: who should benefit? Who should benefit from these housing sales? How much of a subsidy do we apply? How much public money do we use to make these properties affordable? And then how much does the homeowner get to carry with them into their next transaction? We're looking very strongly at the pros and cons of 501c3 nonprofit status, because I think, as Chip can probably enlighten us about, the government, state and federal programs place income eligibility limits on the people that a nonprofit charitable organization can serve. And at the moment, those limits are pretty low, so that we're not quite sure how we would actually serve workforce people, particularly skilled workforce people, because they may fall above the limit that's established by HUD and Maine Housing and the others, and the other agencies that provide financing for this kind of venture that we're talking about. Should we build, or should we try to buy property? Should we partner with the towns? Or in general, the bottom line question is, where will the money come from? Before I go to the last slide, I want to ask, does anybody recognize where this top photograph comes from? That's North Haven, actually. They have a land trust. And the bottom one is from Freeport. They have a very successful land trust that focuses on rentals and senior housing. Okay, final slide. So we're just now, actually tomorrow, going to finish our benchmarking exercise. We will have talked to 7 people who have run or organized successful land trusts in Maine, and one in Massachusetts, one in Vermont. And here are some of their recommendations. I call the first one the "don't try this at home" recommendation. Consult tax, legal, and financial experts, because the complexities of forming a 501c3, particularly in housing, are almost daunting and require expert advice. They all say also build your institutional capacity, both with taking on a small project and then taking on larger projects, and particularly with hiring a professional staff and recruiting a highly qualified board. Get as many of those experts in the first bullet as you can on your board. Form strong partnerships with builders, employers, state and local agencies, town governments, banks, and everyone else who is going to be relevant to your operations. And finally, and this one is, I think, a particular challenge for us, build a committed donor base. In addition to public money that's available through various state and federal agencies, most of the successful housing trusts have a very strong base of private donors who contribute a substantial amount of the capital and operating expenses. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to hold this up. This is number 0001 of the needs assessment. It's about 30 pages long, and I would be happy to, or actually I'm going to send it to Joan, and I assume that as committee chairman, she'd be happy to send it around to anyone who wants to read the detail.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity to talk with you about it.
Thank you, Rob. I'm going to turn over the Q&A session to Joan, and you
Right,
comfortable
thank you.
starting?
Thank you so much, Rob, for that. I know that you had to cover a huge subject in a short period of time, so I hope people will request copies of your full report and get acquainted with more of the information you've so painstakingly collected. So I have a couple of questions in the chat window, and anybody else who'd like to chime in with questions, please feel free to do so. The first question is from Chip Holmes. Rob, are you using 30% of family income to baseline the affordability of housing?
Well, actually, I mean, that's something that's a discussion that we want to get you involved in. We've been using 80% because that's the upper limit of most of the housing trusts that we've talked to. Our current understanding, which we're hoping that you can help us with, is that potentially would disqualify us or cause problems for us with our 501c3 application to the IRS, because it's above what they say in their rules. However, we've interviewed a few housing trusts that have been able to get that 80% figure expanded. Island Housing Trust on MDI is up, I think, has 120. John, is that right? 120%, and
they report that they've gone as high as 180, but most of their clients are at the 120.
And then Martha's Vineyard has gotten a ruling that allows them to serve 140% because their housing market is so expensive and their wages aren't any higher than anyone else's. But what we haven't been able to figure out is sometimes the IRS will say, well, you can do that, but you can only X% of your beneficiaries or your clients can be in that bracket, and then you have to go down to 60 or whatever the number is they want based on various rules. So this is the next big area that we are trying to understand, and this is the don't do it at home aspect that we've come up against.
Bob, could we just clarify for the group that the percentage of average mean income is defined for the IRS by HUD. HUD determines the average mean income in our region to be $70,000. So at 80%, that is, I think that is 56,000 and change.
Right.
And I think 120% is just under $100,000 of family income. If in HUD's rule, that's based on a family of 4.
Right. And at 50%, and an annual income of $56,000 would qualify you for a mortgage on, I think it's $135,000 house or $150,000 house. So, which basically also does not exist in our region anymore. So that's where the IRS rules and the reality of MidCoast, Maine seem to conflict or bump into each other. Anyway.
Okay, is it okay if I go to the next question?
Sure.
This one's from Sally Smith, and I'm not sure if this is something you've looked into, Rob, but maybe somebody else in the group may have if you haven't. The question is Quarry Hill an example of a land trust?
No, Quarry Hill's privately owned and operated.
There you go. Thank you. Simple answer. Utamolator asks, do we know of communities that legally limit how many houses/apartments can be purchased by folks who will not be living in the community beyond a few weeks, a year? Are there places where you can't just live in your home for a few weeks? Do we know of any situations like that?
Yeah, all of the housing trusts require that we've talked to require 12 months a year residents that in actual fact is you're allowed 30 days, generally allowed 30 days for vacation or travel or whatever, but it has to be owned and occupied by the homeowner.
I think the question might have implied, do we know of communities that have done that? are there municipalities that have ever done that? I don't know of any, but
Yeah, I don't know of any either.
okay.
It's a good question.
Yeah, but the research wasn't about other town zonings. It was really all about housing trusts. So we may not answer that.
I've been aware of kind of tangentially in response to the question, I've been aware of some towns that have taxed people that are not residing in their residence, but renting it out or using it as a winter, as a summer home. In other words, they're trying to get on top of this situation that we have here in Rockport and Camden, where many of the homes, for instance, on my street are occupied in the summer only, and all for the other 9 months they're closed up. And so some towns have looked at taxing people that either are in a Airbnb and don't live in the house. It seems to be one approach.
So Valley Geiger, who, by the way, Valley, welcome to the meeting. She's visiting from the committee that has
Thank
been
you. I'm
working
on a quick lunch break from our legislative committee. Sorry, I was
Anyway, your comment is very helpful, saying it's not legal to limit owners to full-time residency. Vermont does allow municipalities to require part-time residencies to pay a higher property tax rate. That is not allowed in Maine.
That's correct.
Thank you for that. So I'm just going through here. Oh, here's a question from Diane Lepson. Thinking about the challenges that the Smith family has with the Friends of Rockport in building the Rockport Harbor Hotel, do you think that any trust would need to take into consideration legal fees by people advocating NIMBYism?
Well, so there's been with the other housing trusts on the coast here, that are basically our models. There's been sort of a split experience, but what they all recommend is that you build up your community support, spend a couple of years, or this doesn't happen overnight, and work very closely with the towns, and then sort of minimize that, and also find areas. Generally, when the Island Housing Trust on MDI, for example, has built properties, it's been with not only overwhelming community support, but also in areas that are not, that are sort of out of the way. So typically, a conservation land trust will have some frontage on a road somewhere that's really not very valuable for conservation, and they'll turn over 2 or 3 acres to the land trust. So I wouldn't try to build one of these things in the middle of Rockport, would be my. But maybe. I mean, maybe you should. You should have. I mean, you should always have some money for legal issues, I suppose. I think there are probably places where you could do this and not get a lot of opposition, which doesn't mean zero opposition, obviously.
Diane's response in the chat window to your answer is, so risks of lawsuits would be mitigated by community collaboration.
Yeah, you'd hope. And citing. So I don't know, Susan and I, for quite a long time, our major line of business was helping people who were building capital projects minimize local public opposition. And a lot of it, a lot of it is choosing the right site, choosing a site that's not going to annoy a lot of people. And so that was often quite hard for our clients to understand, because they bought that piece of land and damn it, they thought they should be able to build anything they wanted on it, but it's not the reality.
Bruce Cobb asks, is there any move to tax second homes at a higher rate than primary homes?
Can somebody answer that? not me.
Oh, is Valley still there? She might be able to. Still here.
I'm still here. I can answer that. There is certainly energy in the legislature to think about doing that. Everyone is aware of the housing crisis. It extends far beyond the Midcoast. However, I think, and I'll need to confirm this, I think the change that needs to happen is to the Maine Constitution, which is a heavy lift.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question, Bruce. It's a really good question.
Okay, I think, oh wait, I think I've read all the questions that are in the chat room. Oh wait, here's a hand raised. Joe Curl, unmute yourself.
I just wondered how this overlaps with the homeless coalition that exists already in the area. And I know they've been working with Habitat on some housing, which we also heard from in this group. So I just wondered how all these different groups will work together, or will they work together?
Well, that is a very good question, Joe. I mean, that is really one of the issues that I'd say we're focused on right now, is trying, because so with KCHC, the Homeless Coalition, it's a little easier to see because they deal with a very specific population that needs services as well as housing, right? So, and no one else that I know of, no other nonprofit in the area provides that particular mix. Habitat works with a different part of the population. They have a model which Habitat does not. Their model is different, and also their pace of construction is slow because that's a part of their model. The model they have does not really address the idea of permanent affordability. So they build a house and they sell it outright, land and buildings, and then they move on to another project. Land trust goes at a different issue, which is the perpetual affordability of projects. And so generally around the country where both of them are present in an area, they work together. Often the land trust will provide some land and Habitat will build the house. There are various ways for them to collaborate, and we've been trying to sort of inventory those ways so that we're working together and not just competing for the same money. That discussion with Habitat here with Tia is just beginning, because we had to figure out what a land trust was before we could figure out how we could work with other people. I hope does that answer your question?
Any other questions out there? Oh, here's one from Bruce. How many people are directly served by some of the land trusts in Maine? By people served, I mean people who are able to find affordable housing.
Okay, well, Island Housing Trust on MDI has about 43 or 44 families. They have benefited, so not all, and it's been going for since the early 2000s. So they say that they benefited 140 some odd, 147, I think it is, individuals, right? And 43 families right now are living in their properties. They're building more. They tend to build in units of 3 because that's what they can afford. They have to raise money in between. And they're shooting to add a total of 200 properties in the 4 towns of on MDI. There's a trust on Deer Isle, which I think has suspended operations because of a lack of financing, but they benefit. They have about, I think they have about a dozen or so tenants. I mean, homeowners. Freeport has a ton. I don't even remember the numbers, but if you go on their website or wait for the benchmarking report, which should be finished, I hope, next week, they have several hundred, but they're all rental. Okay, so they acquire and they either build, but preferably acquire existing rental properties, attach permanent affordability clauses to them, and then either redevelop them as rentals or they buy existing apartment buildings, because they say people especially among workforce households, they're the ones who are most vulnerable to being tossed out of their home and having to drive across three counties to get to work. That was a decision that they made early on in their life. And then if we go down to Martha's Vineyard, which is also a very good model for us because of the very high housing market and the very high number of seasonally occupied homes, they have 73 individual homes and 150 odd rental units. So, you know, this is one of the issues that we face actually, is what can we do, you know, starting from nothing really, what can we do, and can we really have an impact on the problem? I mean, I think that informally, I would say within our group, and I'm here, Joan and John can correct me, but I think that we might start with at the scale of the Island Housing Trust on MDI, but I think we'd be disappointed if we worked 10 years and only had 40 properties in our portfolio. Was that, John, is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say, that the people who would be investing their time and effort would want to make a larger impact on the workforce housing in this area. I agree.
Anybody else like to comment or ask a question?
Joan, I would, but only if really there are no other questions.
Don't see anyone else with their hand up, and I don't have any further chat messages, so go ahead.
So before I turn this over to our Sergeant at Arms, Jeff, you can find me for this, but just as a practical example of the need, because what Rob really presented was a detailed and extensive needs assessment for our area. I had a Maine resident reach out to me who's in the marine publication business, whose son is who's finished college and is going to be taking a position at Rockport Marine in May, and is desperately trying to find a place that he can rent or live or share. And he's getting quite discouraged. The father shared with me that it's a full-time position, wants to be living in, you know, the Camden, Rockport, Rockland area. You know, he believes that he could handle up to $900 a month as far as his cost of housing. But those places don't seem to exist. And I mean, I think that's pretty sad to forfeit a really excellent community member who will probably be here for some time and be in an industry that is supported by our region. That's just a tough one. So that's my sad dollars as I introduce Jeff. Unless someone here is going to say, you know, I have an in-law apartment that's not rented and I'd like to talk to you, John. So I'd like to hear from you. Jeff, are you ready?
I am ready. Greetings, fellow Rotarians and guests. First on my agenda for this week is we have present our Honorable John Sherman, and I'd like to do a John Sherman birthday challenge for the month of January. If it hasn't already been done yet, I don't think it has. Do I have anybody that would like to offer up the fact that they have a birthday this month? I see Bob Baldwin's hand up. This is going to be a big money event right here. Bob?
So you want to know how much I'm going to contribute?
I do.
Okay, I'll contribute $10 for my birthday and tomorrow. But
All right.
only I won't make you guys